It was supposed to be the happiest afternoon of my life. Instead, 2 patrol cars rolled up my driveway mid-ceremony. 40 guests went silent, glasses of champagne frozen in hand. My bride's hands were shaking, but mine stayed still. I had a feeling this moment had been coming for months, because the woman who called them didn't expect who'd answer. The officers stepped out, looked at my face, and stopped cold. What happened in the next 10 minutes changed everything. My name is Marcus Hale, 34 years old, a structural engineer who spent a decade building bridges and, apparently, patience. I live in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet Georgia subdivision with manicured lawns, a homeowners association newsletter nobody reads, and one neighbor who reads every line of the bylaws like scripture. That neighbor's name is Deborah Pratt. She's been HOA president for 6 years, and in that time she has made herself the self-appointed keeper of what she calls neighborhood standards. I didn't know yet that our wedding day would become the day those standards finally broke. Simone and I bought our house on Chestnut Hollow Lane 2 years earlier, the first black family on a street of 11 identical brick colonials. The neighbors mostly waved. Deborah Pratt did something different. She introduced herself with a clipboard in hand. "Just so you know," she said on move-in day. Eyes flicking to our moving truck. "We have very specific guidelines here about landscaping, parking, and noise. I like to get ahead of these things." I thanked her. She didn't smile. Within a month, we received our first violation notice. A laminated card taped to our mailbox citing, "Unapproved mulch color." Our mulch was brown. The house next to ours had red mulch for 3 years with no letter ever sent. Simone laughed it off at first. "She's just thorough," she said. Tossing the card in a drawer, we started calling the Deborah drawer. By the time of our wedding, that drawer held 11 notices. 11 for 2 people who mowed their lawn every Saturday. My mother, Loretta, visited often and noticed the pattern faster than we did. "Baby, that woman isn't thorough," she told me over dinner one night. "She's watching you." And surveillance. And I know which one this is. I didn't want to believe it. Having problems with data, not suspicion. So I started keeping my own records, photos, timestamps, copies of every notice, the same instinct that made me good at my job now aimed at my own front yard. Simone's father, James Carter, a retired Army Sergeant Major, had a simpler read on Deborah from the one time he met her. "That's a woman used to being obeyed," he said. "The second somebody stops obeying, she's going to escalate. Mark my words, son." By spring, Deborah had appointed herself unofficial monitor of every gathering on our street. She once called the county about a birthday party 2 houses down, for a 6-year-old, citing excessive vehicle congestion. The family never got an apology, just a warning letter. When Simone and I got engaged that March, we decided on a backyard wedding. Small, intimate, 70 guests at most, string lights strung between our oaks. Her grandmother's recipes on the catering table. It felt like the one thing in that neighborhood that could be entirely ours. We did everything by the book. I emailed the HOA board in April requesting formal approval for a 1-day outdoor event with amplified music until 9 p.m., attaching a noise permit application and a certificate of insurance, because I already knew who might come looking for a reason to object. Deborah replied within the hour, unusually fast for her. "Received and noted. The board will review," she wrote. CCING the other two members, who rarely responded to anything. I saved that email. Yes, that day. 3 weeks passed with no follow-up, so I called the board secretary directly. She confirmed the event had been approved at their April meeting, unanimously, with Deborah's own vote recorded in the minutes. I printed those minutes and filed them next to the email. Just in case. Just in case had become a habit with us by then. Simone started saving every text Deborah sent, every photo of a violation notice, every voicemail complaining about our garbage cans being improperly angled. We weren't paranoid. We were, as my mother put it, prepared. In May, Deborah stopped Simone in the driveway to ask about guest parking for the wedding. Simone explained we'd hired a valet service and reserved the church lot 3 blocks over. Deborah nodded slowly, said, "I see," and wrote something down on her clipboard. That night, Simone told me something felt different about the exchange. Not the words, but the look on Deborah's face, like she was filing away ammunition rather than information. I told her she was overthinking it. I was wrong, and I'd learn exactly how wrong soon enough. 2 weeks before the wedding, Deborah sent a mass email to the whole street titled, "Reminder, Community Peace and Quiet Standards." It didn't mention us by name. It didn't have to. Reply all, with a thumbs up understood exactly who it was aimed at. My best man, Andre, who'd known me since freshman year of college, drove down from Charlotte the week before and sat on our porch listening to the whole saga. "Man," he said, shaking his head, "some people can't stand watching black joy happen in daylight." I laughed it off in front of him, the way you laugh off a splinter you haven't pulled yet. Inside, though, something in me had already started bracing for the day itself, running through scenarios the way I used to run stress tests on a bridge design. Simone's mother flew in from Ohio a few days before the wedding and immediately clocked the tension on our street. "There's a woman across the way who keeps peeking through her blinds every time a car pulls into your driveway," she said. I counted 4 times in an hour. I told her it was probably nothing. But that Friday night, setting up the tent poles in the backyard, I caught Deborah standing at her fence line with a small notebook, watching the crew work, writing something down every few minutes like she was building a case file. By the morning of the wedding, I wasn't nervous about vows or rings. I was nervous about a woman with a clipboard, a notebook, and 6 years of practice turning small grievances into official complaints, and I had no idea yet how far she'd actually go. The morning of the wedding was warm and gold, the kind of Georgia June day photographers dream about. String lights glowed faintly even in daylight. Chairs lined the lawn in soft rows, and my mother cried before I even had my jacket on, calling it the most beautiful yard in the state. At 9 a.m., a white sedan I didn't recognize crawled past our house twice, slow enough that our valet attendant noticed and pointed it out to me. I didn't think much of it. Wedding days make everyone jumpy. I had bigger things on my mind, like my vows. By 10, the caterers arrived, followed by the string quartet, followed by my 2 nephews chasing each other around the dessert table until my sister corralled them. Everything felt like it was finally clicking into place after months of preparation, arguments about napkin colors, and Deborah drawer paperwork. 10:30. Deborah appeared at the edge of our property line in a sun hat, holding a tape measure. She said she was just confirming setback compliance for the tent.
I reminded her.
Politely, that the event had board approval and handed her nothing, because I'd learned by then to give her nothing extra. She measured anyway, muttering to herself, then walked away without a word. No thank you, no acknowledgement of the approval I'd mentioned. My mother watched the whole exchange from the porch, arms crossed. That woman is building something, she said quietly. I don't know what yet, but she's building it. At 11, guests started arriving, aunts in bright dresses, cousins with kids in tiny suits, Simone's college roommates squealing in the driveway. Laughter carried across the yard, warm and easy, the kind of sound that fills a neighborhood on a Saturday and usually nobody minds at all, except somebody minded. 3 more cars from our street had joined Deborah's driveway, neighbors I recognized from her email chain, standing at her fence line in a loose cluster, arms crossed, watching our yard the way you'd watch a storm rolling in. I noticed but didn't let it touch me. Simone was getting ready upstairs, and my job that morning was to keep everyone calm, fed, and on schedule, not to referee a property line. Still, a small, cold part of me clocked every face at that fence. At noon, the officiant, Pastor Ruth, arrived and walked the yard with me, blessing the space in her quiet way, running her hand along the arch of white flowers Simone's aunts had built by hand. This is sacred ground today, she told me. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. I didn't know then how literally I'd need to hold on to that sentence. By 12:30, the string quartet was tuning, guests were seated, and the only sound out of place was a car door slamming twice, hard, from the direction of Deborah's driveway. At 12:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony, Deborah walked to the edge of our yard again, this time with 2 other neighbors flanking her like she'd assembled a small delegation. We need to talk about the noise ordinance, she announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. I explained, calmly, for the 3rd time that month, that we had a permit, board approval, and an end time of 9 p.m. that fell well within county limits. She said the permit looked unofficial to her. I asked what specifically looked unofficial. She had no answer. James, Simone's father, stepped beside me then, tall and steady in his suit, 30 years of military bearing radiating off him without a single raised word. Ma'am, he said evenly, you've been told the facts 3 times. I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself a 4th. Deborah's face tightened and walked back toward her house, phone already in hand. My mother caught my eye across the yard and mouthed one word, watch. I nodded. Bibs. The wedding day nerves had quietly turned into something sharper. At 1 p.m., the quartet began the processional. Simone appeared at the top of the porch steps in her mother's altered lace gown, and every thought about Deborah Pratt evaporated from my head like morning fog burning off a field. For a few minutes, nothing else existed. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and I forgot the clipboard, the tape measure, the notebook, the fence line audience. I forgot everything except the woman in front of me, and for the length of those vows, our backyard really was the only sacred ground I needed. Simone, take you, Marcus, she began, voice steady despite the tears already welling. I barely registered Pastor Ruth's next words, because somewhere past Simone's shoulder, faint but unmistakable, I heard the low crackle of a police radio drifting over the fence from Deborah's driveway. I kept my eyes on Simone. Whatever was happening behind me, I decided in that instant, would not steal one more second of this ceremony. My mother's warning replayed in my head, watch. But for these vows, I chose to look only at my bride. I promised to build a life with you the way I build everything, I said when it was my turn. With patience, with care, and with the belief that what we're making will outlast every storm that tries to knock it down. I meant every word. More than I knew yet. Pastor Ruth pronounced us married at 1:22 p.m. Applause rippled through the yard. Genuine and warm. Aunts crying. My nephews cheering too loud. The quartet swelling into something triumphant. For 30 whole seconds, it was the wedding we'd planned, untouched by anything happening past the property line. Then, over the applause, I heard tires on gravel, doors opening, and a voice through a radio clipped an official. I turned toward the sound and saw 2 patrol cars easing to a stop at the curb in front of our house. Lights off, but very much present. The applause thinned into murmurs. Guests turned in their chairs, following my gaze toward the street. Simone's hand tightened around mine, her bouquet trembling slightly, though her face stayed composed in a way that told me she'd been half expecting this too. Somewhere underneath the joy. Stay here, I told her quietly, kissing her temple before walking toward the front yard alone. My mother started to follow, but James put a gentle hand on her shoulder. Let him handle it, he said. He's earned that much dignity on his own wedding day. I reached the front yard just as 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles. A tall man with a name tag reading Marsh, and a shorter woman, Reyes, both moving with the unhurried caution of people who'd been given a vague, unverified call about a disturbance. Deborah stood near her own driveway, arms crossed, chin lifted like a woman presenting evidence in court. Officers, thank you for coming, she called out. There's a large unauthorized gathering next door. Loud music, illegally parked cars, and I have reason to believe it's unpermitted. Officer Marsh glanced past her toward our yard. String lights, folding chairs, a quartet packing up violins. 70 people in their Sunday best holding champagne flutes instead of anything resembling a threat. His expression shifted almost immediately from alert to visibly uncertain. Ma'am, this looks like a wedding, he said, not unkindly, scanning the scene again. Is there a specific complaint, noise after hours, a permit violation, something documented? Deborah hesitated, just a beat too long, before repeating the word unauthorized, like it alone should settle the matter. That was when I stepped forward, still in my wedding suit, boutonniere slightly crushed from Simone's embrace. I'm the homeowner, I said, extending my hand to Officer Marsh. And the groom, on file and a noise permit good until 9 tonight. I can show you both. Officer Reyes's eyes moved from my face to my suit to the wedding scene behind me, and something in her posture changed. Not suspicion, but recognition. The look of someone recalculating an entire situation in real time. She glanced at her partner. He glanced back. Moment. Sir, Marsh said slowly, can I ask, were you notified of any noise complaints before today? Through the HOA or the county? I said no. None. Ever. and that, in fact, we'd gone out of our way to secure written approval months in advance specifically because of prior friction with this neighbor. Deborah's voice sharpened. I never confirmed it personally. I pulled out my phone. Already open to her own email reply from April, received and noted, CCING the board, and held it out. Officer Reyes read it, then looked up at Deborah with an expression I recognized. Disbelief. Ma'am, this is your email address, Reyes said, turning the phone slightly so Marsh could see too. You replied to this yourself. Deborah's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since I'd known her, Deborah Pratt didn't have an immediate answer ready on her clipboard. There must be some misunderstanding, she said finally, voice thinner than before. I simply don't recall approving amplified music past a certain hour. I pulled up the permit next. Time-stamped. County issued. Listing 9 p.m. as the cutoff 2 hours later than it currently was. Officer Marsh exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. The universal gesture of a man realizing he'd been sent somewhere he shouldn't have needed to come. Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing, there's no violation here. This is a permitted, approved private event. That's when Officer Reyes said something that stopped everyone at that fence line cold. I actually recognize this address, she said, glancing at her partner. We got a call about a kid's birthday party here last summer too. Different family, same complainant. I remember the case number. Deborah's face went pale in a way I hadn't seen before. Not embarrassment exactly, but the particular panic of someone realizing a pattern they thought was invisible had just become very, very visible to the two people standing in front of her with badges and body cameras. That was an entirely different situation, Deborah said quickly. But her voice had lost its earlier certainty, replaced by something closer to backpedaling. Marsh looked at her for a long moment, then back at me, then at the wedding party now gathering quietly at the property line behind me. Sir, I apologize for the interruption, he said, and he meant it. I could hear the difference between a scripted courtesy and an actual apology. We were dispatched on limited information. Enjoy your day. One here. He tipped his hat, almost instinctively, toward Simone. Applause broke out again. Smaller this time, quieter, but somehow more powerful than the first round after our vows. The sound of 70 people exhaling a fear none of them had wanted to name out loud. My mother pressed a hand to her chest. James nodded once, satisfied, but Deborah wasn't finished. As the officers turned to leave, she raised her voice one more time. This isn't over. Plaint with the county about that noise permit's legitimacy, and I expect the board to revisit that approval at our next meeting. Officer Reyes paused halfway to her car and looked back at Deborah with an expression that had cooled from professional patience into something flatter. More careful. Ma'am, filing repeated complaints against the same residents without cause can constitute harassment. I think carefully before your next call. I watched Deborah absorb that sentence like a slap she hadn't seen coming. For 6 years, she'd been the one issuing warnings. Standing at her own fence line, in front of 2 officers and a yard full of witnesses, she'd just received her first one. The patrol cars pulled away a few minutes later, and the yard slowly reassembled itself into a wedding again. The quartet resumed a soft instrumental. The caterers uncovered trays of food. My nephews went right back to chasing each other like nothing had happened at all. But something had happened, and everyone at that reception knew it. What none of us knew yet, what I wouldn't learn until nearly 2 weeks later, was that Officer Reyes's mention of a different family, same complainant, was only the surface of a much deeper pattern. That night, after the last guest left and the string lights had burned down to a soft amber glow, Simone and I sat on the porch steps still in our wedding clothes, exhausted in the good way, and in the way that comes from surviving something too. "You were so calm out there," she said, resting her head on my shoulder. I told her the truth, that I hadn't felt calm at all, that my hands had been steady only because I'd rehearsed exactly this scenario in my head for months, hoping I'd never need it. "She's not going to stop," Simone said quietly, watching the last of the lights flicker. "Women like her never think they've lost until they've lost everything." I didn't disagree, but I also didn't yet realize how right she was, or how soon we'd both find out. The next morning, still riding the glow of the wedding, we noticed a new laminated notice already taped to our mailbox, dated that same Sunday, before 9 a.m., citing excessive vehicle traffic and noise disturbance in violation of community standards. Deborah hadn't waited even a full day. I photographed it, added it to the Deborah drawer, now at 12 notices, and sent copies to the board secretary along with the police incident number Officer Reyes had referenced. If Deborah wanted a formal complaint, I decided she was finally going to get formal documentation right back. 3 days later, the board secretary called to say Deborah had requested an emergency meeting to discuss repeated noise and safety concerns on Chestnut Hollow Lane, specifically naming our household. It would be held the following Thursday, open to residents. I told Simone we needed to be there. My mother insisted on coming too, bringing a folder of her own, every photo, every timestamp, every screenshot Simone had saved over 2 years. "You don't walk into a fight like this with just your good manners, baby," she said. "You walk in with a paper trail." What none of us anticipated was that Deborah's emergency meeting would open a door she couldn't close again, because the moment she stood up to accuse us in front of the whole board, another resident in that room would raise a hand with a story of her own. The week between the wedding and the HOA meeting felt strange, suspended, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. Neighbors who'd never spoken to us before started waving from their driveways, some almost apologetically, as if the incident had cracked something open they'd been quietly noticing for years. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who lived 2 doors down, stopped me while I was getting the mail. "Saw those cop cars Saturday," he said, shaking his head. "Wasn't right. Everybody on this street thinks like Deborah does." It meant more than he knew. Simone went back to work at the Children's Hospital that Monday, still glowing from the wedding, though she admitted the notice on our mailbox had put a small dent in the afterglow. "I just want to enjoy being married," she told me. "Just for a minute. Before the next fight." I gave her that minute where I could. We spent the evenings that week doing ordinary things, hanging photos from the wedding, thank you cards spread across the kitchen table, my mother teaching Simone her cornbread recipe. Small, quiet proof that our life together was bigger than one neighbor's grudge. But underneath the ordinary evenings, I kept working. I requested the HOA's official complaint log through a public records request, curious how many times Deborah's name appeared as the filer. The answer, when it came back 3 days later, was more than I expected, and less isolated than I'd feared. 14 complaints in 18 months. All filed by Deborah Pratt. All against households that, when I cross-referenced the addresses, belonged to the only 3 black or interracial families on our street. Not one complaint against any of the 8 other households, several of which had documented louder violations. I sat with that spreadsheet for a long time before showing anyone. It wasn't proof of intent by itself, numbers rarely are, but it was a pattern too precise to be coincidence. And patterns, I'd learned in engineering, are usually the first sign that a structure is compromised. I brought the records to James, who'd spent 30 years reading patterns for a living in a different kind of way. He studied the spreadsheet in silence, then set it down carefully. "This isn't a Karen having a bad week," he said. "This is a campaign. And documented." Andre, still in town for a few extra days before heading back to Charlotte, suggested something I hadn't considered, reaching out to a local reporter he knew who covered housing and community issues for the regional paper. "People need to see the pattern, not just hear about it," he said. I hesitated. This handled quietly, through the board, through process, through the polite channels I'd been raised to trust. My mother, listening from the kitchen doorway, had a different opinion entirely. "Baby, quiet channels are how women like her have survived this long." Simone, when I showed her the 14 complaint spreadsheet that night, went very still for a long moment before speaking. "She called the county on a 6-year-old's birthday party," she said softly. "I remember hearing about that when we first moved in. I didn't put it together until right now. That was the moment the shape of things fully clicked for both of us. Not one bad neighbor having one bad wedding weekend, but a much longer, colder pattern finally catching up with itself, and an HOA meeting 3 days away that Deborah herself had scheduled to attack us first. "She thinks she's calling us in front of the board," Simone said, closing her laptop with a soft click. "She has no idea she's about to walk into the one room where every piece of that spreadsheet can finally be read out loud, in order, with dates attached." Thursday night arrived warm and still, the kind of Georgia evening where cicadas hum louder than conversation. The HOA clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Word had clearly spread beyond our street, and several neighbors I barely recognized filed in behind us, folders and phones in hand. Deborah arrived early, as always, seated at the head table beside the 2 other board members. A stack of papers squared neatly in front of her like she'd rehearsed this moment for days. She didn't make eye contact with us as we took seats near the back. The meeting opened with routine business, a landscaping vendor contract, a pool schedule change, voices flat and administrative. The room's tension coiled just beneath the surface like a held breath waiting for its excuse to release. Everyone knew the real agenda item was still coming. "Next," the board secretary said, glancing at her notes, "we have an emergency item requested by President Pratt regarding repeated noise and safety violations at 214 Chestnut Hollow Lane." Every head in the room turned, slow and deliberate, toward the back row where Simone and I sat. Deborah stood, smoothing her blazer, and began reading from her prepared notes in the same clipped, authoritative tone she'd used on our lawn for 2 years. "This household has shown a consistent disregard for community standards, culminating in an unauthorized gathering that required police intervention last Saturday. I move that the board revoke prior event approvals for this residence and impose a formal warning status," she continued, sliding copies of a document toward the other 2 members. It was, I noticed, the 12th violation notice she'd issued us, presented as if it were new evidence. I stood before she'd even finished distributing the papers. May I respond? I asked the board secretary, who nodded, visibly relieved to have someone push back on a room that had clearly been steamrolled by Deborah before. Deborah's jaw tightened, but she sat, arms crossed, waiting. My name is Marcus Hale, I began, keeping my voice level the way I would presenting to a client. I'd like to enter into record the email in which President Pratt personally approved our wedding event in April, including the noise permit hours she now claims to dispute. I read the email aloud, word for word, including her own signature line. A ripple moved through the room, not gasps exactly, but the low murmur of people recalculating what they thought they knew about the woman at the head table. Deborah's face had gone very still. I'd also like to enter the county noise permit, I continued. Time-stamped and valid until 9 p.m. The night of our wedding. 2 hours passed when President Pratt's own complaint claims we were in violation. I handed copies to the secretary, who passed them silently down the table. And finally, I said, pulling out the spreadsheet James had helped me format the night before, I'd like to enter this public complaint log, obtained through a records request,
documenting 14 HOA complaints filed by President Pratt over 18.
I read the addresses aloud, then the demographic pattern behind them, careful to stick only to documented fact, not accusation. Every other household on Chestnut Hollow Lane has 0 complaints filed against it in that period, despite several documented, louder incidents involving other residents. I said, I'll let the board draw its own conclusions. The room went very quiet. One of the other board members, a soft-spoken man named Roland who rarely spoke at meetings, leaned forward and studied the spreadsheet for a long moment before looking up at Deborah. Deborah, he said slowly, is this accurate? 14. All these same 3 addresses. The numbers can be misleading out of context, Deborah said. But her voice had thinned into something brittle, all her earlier certainty gone. I simply hold this community to a standard. If certain households happen to need more oversight, that's circumstance. Not anything else. That was when a woman near the front row raised her hand. Someone I didn't recognize. Older. Seated with a younger man beside her. I'd like to speak, she said. Standing before the secretary could even call on her. Deborah's eyes flicked toward her, and something in her posture changed instantly. My name is Carol Simmons, the woman said. I lived 2 doors down from Deborah for 4 years before I moved across the neighborhood. I want this board to know she filed 11 complaints against my family in that time too, before I was even on that spreadsheet. A murmur rippled through the room again, louder this time. My husband is Vietnamese, Carol continued, voice steady but clearly emotional. We used to joke it was almost funny how she timed her complaints around our family visits. I didn't file a records request. I just remember, Deborah's face had drained of nearly all its color now. Roland set down his pen and looked at her with an expression that had shifted fully from confusion into something closer to disappointment. Deborah, he said quietly, how many households? Total. Does this actually touch? That question isn't fair, Deborah snapped. Standing again, papers rustling in her tight grip. I've served this community for 6 years. I've handled hundreds of matters. You cannot reduce my entire tenure to a handful of complaints taken out of context by people with an agenda. Nobody has an agenda except an accurate count, I said, keeping my voice calm even as the room's energy sharpened around us. The email, the permit, and the public complaint log aren't opinions. President Pratt. They're your own words and your own filings. I didn't write any of them. The secretary, visibly uncomfortable but trying to hold the meeting together, cleared her throat. Given the volume of documentation presented tonight, I think this item needs to be tabled for a full board review, not decided informally in an emergency session. Roland nodded immediately, relieved to have an off-ramp. Deborah opened her mouth to object, then seemed to catch herself, glancing around the room at faces that had shifted, almost uniformly, from polite attention into something colder. For the first time in 6 years, the room she'd controlled from the head table no longer felt entirely hers. "Fine," she said finally, voice tight. "Table it." That I still believe this household poses ongoing concerns to community standards. Nobody responded. The silence that followed said more than any rebuttal could have, and Deborah seemed to feel every second of it. The meeting moved on to unrelated business, but the room's attention never fully returned to landscaping contracts. People kept glancing back at us, at Carol Simmons, at Deborah, doing quiet math in their heads about conversations they'd half remembered and never quite questioned until tonight gave them a reason to. Afterward, in the parking lot, Carol found us by our car. "I should have said something years ago," she admitted, eyes glassy. "I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. Watching you stand up there tonight, I couldn't let you do it alone with nobody backing you up." Simone hugged her, unprompted, the two of them standing under the clubhouse floodlights like old friends instead of strangers who'd just met an hour earlier. "You didn't do anything wrong," Simone told her. She counted on all of us staying quiet. That's the only reason she got this far. We drove home that night mostly in silence. The good kind. The kind that comes after finally being heard in a room that had ignored you for years. My mother, waiting up at our kitchen table, took one look at our faces and said, "Well, tell me everything." I told her the email, the permit, the spreadsheet, Roland's question, Carol Simmons standing up unprompted. My mother listened with her hands folded, nodding slowly, and when I finished she said only, "Good. Now we wait and see if that board actually has a spine." We wouldn't have to wait long. Word of the meeting had traveled well past Chestnut Hollow Lane, carried by neighbors who'd been there, by Carol's own retelling, by a community Facebook group where someone had posted a careful, factual summary of what was said. What none of us expected was how fast that summary would find its way to Andre's reporter friend, and how quickly one records request could turn into an actual investigation. The kind that doesn't stay contained inside a single subdivision's clubhouse walls for very long at all. By Saturday, exactly 1 week after our wedding, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. My name is Priya Anand. I'm a reporter with the Tribune covering housing issues," she said. "A friend of yours mentioned a story I think our readers need to see." I hesitated before agreeing to talk. Part of me still wanted this contained to the neighborhood, resolved quietly through the board's process. But my mother, listening on speaker, shook her head firmly. "Baby, quiet is how she's operated for 6 years. Quiet is exactly what protects her." I agreed to an interview, on the condition that it focus on documented facts, not speculation. The email, the permit, the complaint log, the police incident numbers. Priya seemed relieved by the boundary. "That's exactly the kind of story I want to write," she said. "Facts hold up better anyway." While Priya began her own records requests, something else was happening 2 doors down that none of us had anticipated. Carol Simmons, emboldened by the meeting, had started talking to other neighbors, quietly at first, then less quietly, comparing notes about complaints they'd each assumed were isolated incidents. What emerged over the following days was a fuller picture than even my spreadsheet had shown. 2 more households came forward, a Filipino family on the cul-de-sac, and an older black couple who'd lived on the street even longer than Deborah had, both with their own unreported histories. The Filipino family, the Reyes's, no relation to the officer, as it turned out, though the coincidence made Simone laugh for the first time in days, described nearly identical patterns. Complaints timed around visits from extended family, always framed as just following the rules, never once directed elsewhere. The older black couple, the Wilsons, had lived on Chestnut Hollow Lane for almost 20 years, long before Deborah moved in. "We used to think it was just her personality," Mrs. Wilson told Priya during a phone interview. "Now I look back and I see it clear as day." Priya compiled all of it, our documentation, Carol's account, the Reyes family, the Wilsons, cross-referenced against county HOA filing records that confirmed every single complaint had, in fact, originated from Deborah Pratt's registered account, time-stamped and searchable, impossible to dispute or explain away as coincidence. Meanwhile, Deborah's own behavior on the street had shifted into something more erratic. Neighbors reported her walking her usual rounds later at night, notebook still in hand, though several said she now seemed to be avoiding eye contact entirely, moving faster, staying closer to her own property line. One evening, my mother caught her at the mailbox, standing rigid, staring at nothing in particular. "Loretta," Deborah said stiffly, using my mother's first name for the first time in 2 years despite never once having been invited to. My mother simply nodded and kept walking. She'd said enough at the meeting. What we didn't know yet, what would come out only after Priya's investigation deepened, was that Deborah had another motivation pushing beneath the surface of all this.
One that had nothing to do with mulch color or noise ordinances, and everything to do with an announcement she'd been planning for months.
Priya found it almost by accident. Cross-referencing county filings for an unrelated detail, Deborah Pratt had quietly filed paperwork to run for a seat on the county's Zoning and Planning Commission, an election just 11 weeks away, built around a campaign platform of protecting neighborhood integrity. Suddenly, 6 years of escalating complaints made a different kind of sense. Deborah hadn't just been enforcing rules for their own sake. She'd been building a resume, a narrative of vigilant leadership, positioning herself for exactly this next step, with our street as her proving ground. She needed a track record, Priya explained when she called to update me. Complaints, enforcement actions, community oversight, it all reads well on a campaign flyer if nobody looks closely at who those actions were actually targeting. I sat with that revelation longer than I expected to. It reframed everything, not an isolated grudge against one wedding, but a pattern engineered, consciously or not, to build political capital off the backs of the only families on our street who didn't look like her. The wedding hadn't started the pattern. It had simply become its most public failure. I told Simone that night, watching her face shift from surprise into something colder, more resolved. She wasn't just trying to control us, she said slowly. She was trying to use us. We were supposed to be the example that got her elected, not the story that ends her. That resolve settled over both of us differently after that. This had stopped being only about protecting our home. It had become about making sure a pattern built for 6 years on quiet suffering didn't get rewarded with a county commission seat 2 months later. The stakes had changed entirely. Priya's article published on a Tuesday morning. Under the headline Pattern of Complaints, HOA President's enforcement record raises questions ahead of county election. It ran with the email, the permit, the complaint log broken down by household, and on-record quotes from Carol Simmons, the Reyes's, and the Wilsons. By noon, it had been shared thousands of times across local social media, picked up by 2 regional news stations by evening. Deborah's name trended, briefly, in county circles, not the kind of attention any campaign wants 11 weeks before an election, and not the kind that fades quietly. Deborah's response was immediate and, in hindsight, catastrophic for her. Rather than address the documentation directly, she posted a lengthy statement on the neighborhood Facebook group calling the article a coordinated smear campaign by disgruntled residents, and threatening legal action against everyone who'd spoken to Priya. The threat backfired instantly. Screenshots of her post spread even faster than the article itself. And several neighbors who'd stayed silent until now, worried about retaliation, suddenly felt they had nothing left to lose. More stories surfaced within days, some going back nearly a decade. One longtime resident described Deborah reporting a Muslim family's outdoor prayer gathering as an unauthorized assembly back in 2019. Another described a complaint filed against a biracial couple's anniversary party, cited for excessive vehicles, despite the same street hosting a football tailgate with triple the cars a month earlier. Each new account followed the same pattern Priya had already documented, always framed as procedure, always targeting the same narrow slice of the neighborhood, always timed to gatherings that looked, to any objective observer, exactly like the kind of joyful family occasions everyone else's street celebrated freely. Deborah, watching her own campaign implode in real time, made a decision that would prove to be her most reckless yet. Rather than retreat and let the story fade, she doubled down, escalating in a way that revealed just how far she was willing to go under pressure. Late that Wednesday night, motion-activated cameras Simone had installed after the wedding caught Deborah walking along our property line with a flashlight, photographing our garbage cans, our fence, even peering briefly toward our bedroom window before continuing down the fence line toward the Wilsons' house. I watched the footage the next morning with a stillness that surprised even me. Not rage exactly, but a cold, clarifying calm. The same calm I'd felt standing in front of those officers on our wedding day. This wasn't oversight anymore. This was something closer to obsession. I forwarded the footage to Officer Reyes directly, referencing the earlier incident number, and asked whether nighttime surveillance of a private residence's windows constituted harassment under Georgia law. Her response came within the hour. Yes, potentially, and she'd be documenting it as a formal addition to the existing file. That same footage, once shared with Priya, became the centerpiece of her follow-up article 2 days later, headlined "Caught on Camera." HOA president filmed photographing neighbor's property at night. The county commission race, already shaky, took another visible hit as 2 local endorsements were publicly withdrawn. Deborah's campaign manager, a young volunteer named Justin who'd been quietly uneasy for weeks, resigned publicly, posting a brief statement that read only, I can no longer in good conscience continue supporting this campaign. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. What none of us anticipated next was that the unraveling wouldn't stop at the campaign. It would reach into Deborah's own household in a way that finally, undeniably, exposed the hypocrisy at the center of everything she'd built her 6-year reign around, starting with her own son. Tyler Pratt, 26, had been mostly absent from the neighborhood for years, living 2 states away, visiting only on holidays. Few residents even remembered what he looked like. That changed the following weekend, when he showed up at his mother's house, with his fiancée beside him. Her name was Aaliyah, and she was black. Several neighbors recognized her instantly from Deborah's own Facebook photos, posted years earlier during a family trip, always carefully cropped to exclude her, always captioned in ways that mentioned Tyler's visit, without ever naming who he'd brought along. Carol Simmons, watching from her porch, was the first to put it together publicly, posting quietly in the neighborhood group, "Anyone else notice President Pratt has a black daughter-in-law she's never once mentioned in 6 years of newsletters?" The post exploded within hours. Screenshotted, shared, dissected. It wasn't proof of racism by itself. And I was careful, even then, not to treat it as the whole story. People's families are complicated in ways outsiders rarely understand fully. But paired with everything else, the complaint log, the campaign, the flashlight footage, it painted a picture too consistent to dismiss. Priya reached out to Tyler directly, and to my genuine surprise, he agreed to speak, briefly, on the record. "My mother has never been comfortable with Aaliyah," he said. "We usually visit when the neighborhood's quieter. Holidays, late at night. I always told myself it wasn't what it looked like." After reading the article, he continued, voice audibly strained even through Priya's careful paraphrasing, "I can't tell myself that anymore. I don't want to speak for what's in my mother's heart. I can only tell you what I've watched happen to us. Quietly, for years." That quote ran in Priya's 3rd article, and it did something none of the previous documentation had managed. It made the pattern undeniably personal, undeniably close to home, for anyone in the county who'd been giving Deborah the benefit of the doubt up until that point. Deborah, cornered on every front now, the campaign, the footage, her own son's public statement, retreated into near total silence for several days, taking down her social media accounts, declining Priya's requests for comment, avoiding the neighborhood entirely except for brief, hurried trips to her car. The HOA board, under mounting pressure from residents and unable to ignore 3 published articles and a growing petition, scheduled a special session to formally address concerns regarding the conduct of the board president. The petition, started by Carol Simmons, had gathered 43 signatures within 4 days. I hadn't asked anyone to sign it. I hadn't even seen it until Carol texted me a screenshot the morning it launched. "You started something bigger than your wedding," she wrote. "I just wanted you to know that." I sat with that message longer than I expected to. Simone, reading over my shoulder, put it more simply. "We didn't start it," she said. "She did. 6 years ago. One complaint at a time. We just refused to let it stay quiet the way she was counting on." I couldn't argue with that. I didn't want to. The night before the special session, couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety this time, but from something closer to anticipation. The particular restlessness that comes before a structure you've been quietly reinforcing for weeks finally gets tested under its full, intended load. I knew what the documentation showed. I also knew documentation alone doesn't always win. Rules get bent for people who've held power long enough. And Deborah had held hers for 6 years, cultivating relationships, favors, a certain comfortable authority that didn't simply evaporate because of 2 newspaper articles and 1 damning security clip. James called that night, sensing my mood without me saying much at all. "Son," he said, "I've walked into rooms where the paperwork was airtight and still watched good men lose because somebody with rank decided the truth was inconvenient. Be ready for that. You've already won something no board vote can take back," he continued. "You stood on your own lawn on your wedding day and didn't back down. Whatever happens tomorrow, that part's already done." I held onto that the rest of the night, longer than I expected I'd need to. Simone, curled beside me, added her own quieter thought before we finally drifted off. "Whatever they decide," she murmured. "The whole street knows the truth now. That's not nothing." When you think about how long she counted on nobody ever finding out. The morning of the special session. The clubhouse parking lot filled faster and fuller than it had for the emergency meeting 2 weeks earlier. Cars lined the street outside. Residents I genuinely never met before filing in with folders, phones, and the particular energy of people expecting resolution. Priya was there too, seated near the back with a notebook. Though she told me beforehand she'd only report what happened, not participate. Carol sat beside Simone and me, and to my surprise, Tyler and Aaliyah slipped quietly into a row near the side entrance, heads slightly bowed. Deborah arrived last, alone, without her usual stack of prepared papers, without the confident stride that had defined her for 6 years. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely uncertain, a woman walking into a room she no longer controlled and clearly knew it. The board secretary opened the session by reading a formal summary into record, the documented complaint pattern, the wedding incident, the flashlight footage, the withdrawn campaign endorsements, the petition's 43 signatures, laid out in flat, procedural language that somehow made it hit harder than any headline had. Roland, visibly more resolved than he'd been at the previous meeting, spoke first. "I've reviewed everything," he said. "The pattern isn't ambiguous anymore. I move that the board formally censure President Pratt and open a vote on her removal from the position, effective immediately, pending full review." A second board member seconded the motion almost before Roland finished speaking. Deborah stood, opened her mouth as if to object the way she always had, and then, for one of the only times I'd ever witnessed, simply closed it again and sat back down without a word. That silence, more than anything said that night, felt like the true climax of 6 years finally catching up to itself. Not a dramatic confrontation, not another clipboard raised in defense. Just a woman out of arguments, out of allies, and finally, unmistakably, out of power. The vote itself wasn't scheduled for that night. Board bylaws required a 72-hour posting period before any formal removal could be finalized. But everyone in that room understood the outcome was no longer in serious doubt. The question wasn't if, but exactly how it would unfold. What none of us anticipated was that the 72-hour window would bring one final, reckless act from Deborah, the kind of decision people make only when they feel they have nothing left to lose, and everything still to prove. however badly that proof might land. 2 nights after the special session, Simone's security camera picked up movement again near our fence line at nearly midnight. Not Deborah this time, but a car we didn't recognize, idling slowly along the curb before pulling into her driveway instead of continuing down the street. I watched the footage the next morning with a knot forming low in my stomach. A man got out, walked to Deborah's door, and she met him on the porch, both glancing repeatedly toward our house before disappearing inside. Something about the exchange felt deliberately, carefully secretive. I mentioned it to Officer Reyes when I called with an unrelated question about the harassment file status. She went quiet for a moment before asking me to send the footage immediately. "Can you get me the plate number?" she asked. "I want to run something before this goes further." What she found, when she called back 2 hours later, made my stomach drop in an entirely different way. The car belonged to a man named Curtis Rowe, a private investigator Deborah had apparently hired the week the story first broke, according to a state licensing database Reyes cross-checked. "People don't usually hire investigators for HOA disputes," Reyes said carefully. "I want you and your wife to be cautious for a few days. I can't tell you exactly what she's looking for, but given everything already documented, I'd rather we get ahead of it than react after the fact." I told Simone that evening, watching her expression shift from confusion into a controlled, wary alertness I recognized from every conversation we'd had since the wedding. "What is there even left for her to find?" she asked. "We've already handed everything true to the board and the paper. We didn't have a full answer yet. But Priya, when I called her, had a theory rooted in 6 years of covering local politics. Sometimes it's not about finding something true," she said. "Sometimes it's about finding anything they can spin into a distraction before the vote." That theory proved right within 3 days. A new, anonymous complaint appeared in the county's building code database, filed the day before the removal vote, alleging our backyard tent structure from the wedding had violated setback and permanent structure codes. A claim that could, if substantiated, trigger real fines. The complaint was traceable, eventually, back to Curtis Rowe's business address, though the filing itself used a generic county portal that didn't require a name. It didn't take a forensic expert to guess who'd commissioned it, or why it had landed exactly 1 day before the board's vote. I called our original event permit company that same afternoon, requesting written confirmation of every structure's temporary classification and removal timeline. Documentation, thankfully, we'd kept as part of the same, just-in-case habit that had already saved us once during the wedding day confrontation itself. The county inspector who reviewed the file the next morning closed the complaint within hours, noting explicitly that the tent had been temporary, permitted, and removed within the allowed window, the fastest resolution. He told me almost apologetically he'd seen on a complaint in his 6 years on the job. But the damage, if that had been the goal, was never really about winning the complaint. It was about the delay, the distraction, the small seed of doubt planted 1 day before a vote that was supposed to be a clean, documented conclusion to 6 years of harm. Priya, tracking the timeline closely for her next piece, called it exactly what it was in her article's opening line. A last-minute, dismissed complaint reveals not new evidence against a black family's wedding tent, but the lengths one HOA president was willing to go to delay her own accountability. The article ran the morning of the vote, timed almost perfectly, and by the time residents filed into the clubhouse that evening, most had already read it on their phones in the parking lot. faces set with the particular grim resolve of people who'd simply had enough. Deborah arrived even earlier than usual this time, alone again, and took a seat not at the head table but in the audience section, near the back, a small, telling adjustment that spoke louder than anything she could have said about how she now understood her own position. The board secretary opened the session by confirming the 72-hour posting period had elapsed without formal challenge, and that the vote on President Pratt's removal, along with a proposed permanent restriction on future board service, would proceed as scheduled. The room fell into a heavy, expectant hush. Roland moved the motion again, formally this time, citing the documented complaint pattern, the wedding day incident, the surveillance footage, the withdrawn endorsements, and finally, the newly dismissed setback complaint traced to an investigator hired the week the original story broke. Each item landed like another stone on a scale. All in favor, the secretary said, and every hand in that room, all 4 remaining board members, unanimous, rose without hesitation. There was no debate this time, no lingering uncertainty, only the quiet, procedural sound of 6 years finally, formally coming to an end in front of witnesses. Deborah didn't stand to object. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, staring at some fixed point on the clubhouse floor, and for the first time in this entire saga, I found myself feeling something closer to sadness than satisfaction, watching a life's careful architecture finally collapse. That feeling didn't last long, tempered quickly by the memory of 14 documented complaints, a midnight flashlight along our fence line, and a hired investigator dispatched the week her pattern first became public. Sadness and accountability, I was learning, could occupy the same room without canceling each other out. After the vote, the secretary read one final item into record, a formal, board-issued letter of apology to every household named in Priya's reporting, including ours, the Reyes's, the Wilsons, and Carol Simmons, acknowledging a documented failure of oversight that allowed sustained, targeted harassment to continue unaddressed. It wasn't everything of laminated notices, or the specific fear of watching patrol cars pull up on my own wedding day. But it was, finally, an acknowledgement from the institution that had let it happen, and that acknowledgement mattered more than I expected it to. Deborah left the clubhouse that night without speaking to anyone, walking quickly to her car through a parking lot of neighbors who, for once, didn't part to make her path easier the way they always had before. Nobody blocked her. The silence did that work itself. The county commission race, already crumbling under the earlier revelations, effectively ended 2 days later when her name was formally withdrawn from the ballot. No statement, no press release, just a quiet update on the county elections website that most residents only discovered by checking themselves. Justin, her former campaign manager, when reached by Priya for a final comment, offered only a brief, careful sentence. I hope she gets whatever help she needs to understand why this happened. It wasn't gloating. It read, if anything, like genuine, tired disappointment from someone who'd once believed in her. What surprised me most in the days that followed wasn't Deborah's public unraveling, which had felt, by then, almost inevitable. It was the quieter, more private consequence unfolding inside her own house, the one involving her son, and a decision Tyler had clearly been circling for weeks. Tyler and Aaliyah, still staying nearby, stopped by our house unannounced one evening, both looking exhausted in the particular way of people who just had a long, difficult conversation with someone they loved. "I wanted to apologize," Tyler said. "Not for her. Sooner. We invited them in, and over coffee at our kitchen table, Tyler explained what had happened after the vote. A conversation with his mother that had gone nowhere, ending with him telling her plainly that he wouldn't be bringing his future wife back to a house that had never once welcomed her. "She didn't apologize," Tyler said quietly, staring into his mug. "She said I was being dramatic. That's when I knew nothing was going to change, no matter how public any of this got." Aaliyah reached over and took his hand without a word, the gesture saying everything else. Simone, listening with the same steady compassion she brought to every difficult conversation, told them something I hadn't fully considered myself yet. "You don't owe her your silence just because she's your mother," she said. "You already gave more than most people would have." "That's not nothing either." Tyler nodded slowly, and before they left that night, he told us something that would matter more in the weeks ahead than any of us realized at the time, that he'd quietly saved copies of old family group chats. Years of messages where his mother had made her feelings about Aaliyah explicit. "I never planned to use them," he admitted. "I just couldn't delete them either. Some part of me always knew I might need proof someday that I wasn't imagining what I'd been living through." He didn't hand them over that night. He simply wanted us to know they existed. 2 weeks later, once the HOA matter had settled into its new, calmer normal, a county ethics board opened a separate, formal review into Deborah's tenure prompted, we later learned, by a confidential complaint alleging misuse of her board position for personal and political gain, filed by Tyler himself. He included those saved messages, alongside timestamps matching several of the 14 documented HOA complaints, showing a pattern where his mother had specifically discussed sending a message to families she disapproved of in the same conversations where she disparaged his relationship with Aaliyah. It wasn't a criminal matter, the ethics board later clarified, but it was enough to formally bar her from holding any future HOA leadership position countywide, and to trigger a mandatory disclosure on any future political filings referencing the reason for her prior campaign withdrawal, should she ever attempt to run again. When Priya published her final article in the series, closing out nearly 2 months of reporting, she led not with the ethics ruling or the campaign collapse, but with a single, quiet image, the empty spot on Deborah's mailbox where a small HOA president placard had hung for 6 years. Someone, the article noted almost in passing, had removed it the same week the removal vote passed. Nobody claimed responsibility. Nobody needed to. It sat a little quieter after that. Curtains drawn more often than not. A woman inside it finally out of complaints to file. For us, life on Chestnut Hollow Lane slowly settled into something we hadn't fully believed possible 2 months earlier, ordinary. Simone hung our wedding photos in the hallway without flinching at the memory anymore. My mother stopped by less out of worry and more just because she wanted to. Carol Simmons became a genuine friend, not just an ally from one difficult meeting, hosting a small backyard dinner a few weeks later where the Wilsons, the Reyeses, and even Roland from the board showed up. The same yard that had once held patrol cars now holding string lights again. On purpose this time, Officer Reyes stopped by once, off duty, to drop off a final copy of the closed harassment file for our records. "For what it's worth," she said at the door, That was one of the more satisfying case closures I've had in a while. Most of these don't end this clean. I asked her, before she left, what exactly had made her and her partner pause the way they had that first day on our lawn. She thought about it for a moment. Your face, she said simply. You weren't scared. Guilty people don't usually look like that. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected. All those months of keeping records, saving emails, photographing notices, habits born from a quiet, exhausting vigilance, had turned out to be exactly what tipped the scales that day. And every day after it, when it mattered most, Deborah, for her part, sold the house on Chestnut Hollow Lane roughly 10 weeks after the vote, moving, according to neighborhood word, to a small condo 2 counties over. Nobody organized a farewell. Nobody needed to, and went on a quiet Tuesday morning. Tyler and Aaliyah married themselves the following spring in a small ceremony we were genuinely happy to attend. Invited us as honored guests, a gesture that felt, in its own quiet way, like the final closing of a loop none of us had expected to be part of. You didn't just stand up for yourselves, Tyler told me at their reception, voice thick with something between gratitude and old grief. You gave me the proof I needed to finally stop making excuses for her. I don't know if I'd have found the courage otherwise. I told him he'd found it himself. Priya's series on the pattern went on to win a regional journalism award the following year, cited specifically for its meticulous, fact-based documentation over sensationalism, a distinction she mentioned to me once, almost shyly, over coffee, as though she still couldn't quite believe the story had grown as large as it had. It started with one email you saved, she reminded me. That's the part people forget. Big stories like this almost always start with someone quiet, keeping records nobody else thought to keep. I told her I hadn't felt brave doing it, only careful. She said that was usually how it worked. The new HOA president, Roland, elected unanimously after Deborah's removal, made one of his first official acts a formal review of every outstanding violation. Notice issued during her tenure, resulting in the quiet dismissal of every single notice ever filed against our house. The Wilsons, the Reyes's, and Carol. Consider the Deborah drawer officially empty, my mother said the day the letter arrived. And for the first time in 2 years, we actually laughed about it instead of just filing it away with the others. Some fights end in courtrooms. Ours ended in a kitchen, laughing at an empty drawer. A year after the wedding, on our anniversary, Simone and I hosted a small dinner in the same backyard. Same string lights, same oak trees, though the tent was long gone and the guest list smaller, quieter, made almost entirely of people who'd stood with us through the whole thing. James raised a toast that night. Glass lifted toward the fence line where Deborah's old house now belonged to a young family with 2 dogs and a very ordinary amount of noise. To the people who watch, he said, and the people brave enough to keep watching back. Simone squeezed my hand under the table, and I found myself thinking not about the fear of that afternoon a year earlier, but about the 10 minutes that had actually mattered most. 2 officers stepping out of their cars, looking at a groom who wasn't afraid, and simply, finally, stopping. That freeze, I realized now, hadn't been hesitation. It had been the exact moment 2 strangers recognized a pattern for what it was, and chose, for once, to look past a familiar accusation and actually see the truth standing calmly in front of them, holding nothing but proof. What Deborah never understood, even at the very end, was that every notice she'd taped to our mailbox, every complaint she'd filed, every excuse she'd offered, had done the opposite of what she intended, not silencing us, but slowly, methodically building the very case that finally ended her reign. Some people spend their whole lives mistaking control for power, unable to see the difference until the moment both slip away entirely. Deborah had 6 years of one and, in the end, none of the other, undone not by cruelty met with cruelty, but by patience met with proof. We never set out to be the story that ended someone's career, or exposed a hidden family rift, or reshaped an entire neighborhood's understanding of a woman they trusted for years. We only ever wanted a wedding day, a life together, and a home that felt simply ours. In the end, we got exactly that, and something more we hadn't asked for but had certainly earned. A street that finally saw clearly, a board that finally acted, a family reunited on more honest terms, and 2 officers who, on the most important afternoon of our lives, chose to look and to see. Deborah's old fence line still stands between our yards, though the notebook and the tape measure are long gone, replaced by a young family's trampoline and the easy, unremarkable sound of children playing on ordinary Saturday afternoons, the exact kind of noise she once tried so hard to silence. On the 2-year anniversary of our wedding, Priya called again, working on a retrospective piece about accountability in homeowners association statewide, using our story as its anchor. She asked if there was anything I'd want readers, especially anyone currently living through something similar, to actually take away from it. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Keep records, I told her finally. Not out of paranoia, out of self-respect. The people who try to erase your version of events are always counting on you not having one of your own. Don't give them that advantage. Simone added her own answer when Priya asked her separately. Find your Carol Simmons, she said. Somebody on your street probably already knows the pattern too. The hardest part is never proving it. It's finding the people brave enough to say it out loud alongside you. James, when asked, kept his answer characteristically short. Stay calm enough to be believed, he said. Rage gets dismissed. Documentation doesn't. My mother's answer, delivered over the phone with her usual certainty, was simpler still. Baby, the truth doesn't need volume. It just needs somebody willing to keep saying it. Looking back now, I understand the 10 minutes on our lawn that afternoon weren't really the climax of the story, even though they felt like it at the time. Sirens, silence, 70 guests holding their breath. The real climax came weeks later, in a clubhouse, under fluorescent lights, with a spreadsheet, because the wedding day was never really about Deborah at all. Not fully. It was about a system of quiet, unquestioned authority finally being asked, plainly and repeatedly, to show its work and discovering, in front of everyone who'd once trusted it blindly, that it had none worth showing. Officer Marsh, we learned much later through Priya's reporting, ended up training new recruits on de-escalation using an anonymized version of our case. Specifically the moment he and Reyes recognized a pattern before acting on an unverified call. Some good, turned out, outlived the story that created it. The Wilsons, after 20 years of quiet complaints, finally felt comfortable hosting their granddaughter's graduation party the following spring. String lights of their own strung between trees that had watched 2 decades of careful, unspoken caution finally give way to something closer to the ease they'd always deserved. The Reyes family filed, and won, a formal apology from the county after their own retroactive review. Small but real acknowledgement of years spent second-guessing perfectly ordinary family gatherings out of fear a phone call might already be on its way before the party even ended. Carol Simmons ran for the open board seat herself the following year, unopposed, campaigning on exactly one clear promise, that every complaint filed under her tenure would be reviewed for pattern, not just individual merit. A small procedural change that felt, to those of us who'd lived it, monumental. Tyler and Aaliyah, a year into their marriage, welcomed their first child that following winter, a daughter they named after Aaliyah's grandmother, born into a family that had finally, painfully, chosen honesty over comfortable silence, the same choice, in its own smaller way, that had started with one saved email. Deborah, as far as any of us know, never returned to Chestnut Hollow Lane, not even to visit her old house, now filled with someone else's noise, someone else's laughter, someone else's ordinary Saturday afternoons that nobody watches through a fence line with a notebook anymore. I think about her sometimes, not with anger exactly anymore, but with the particular clarity that comes from surviving something and finally understanding its full shape. She spent 6 years mistaking surveillance for stewardship, control for community, and in the end lost the very thing she'd claimed to be protecting. What she never grasped, even watching it all unravel in real time, was that the neighborhood she tried so hard to control had never actually needed her protection. It had needed her absence of judgment, of suspicion, of the particular exhausting vigilance she'd aimed only at the families who looked different. Simone and I still live in that house, still host gatherings under those same string lights, still keep, admittedly, one drawer in the kitchen that used to hold Deborah's notices and now holds nothing at all. Empty on purpose. A small, quiet monument to a fight we never asked for but won anyway. Our daughter, born this past spring, will grow up on a street where the loudest thing anyone watches for now is a good barbecue, where the only clipboard in sight belongs to Roland tallying potluck signups, where the fence line between our yard and the one next door means nothing more than a fence. Some stories end with punishment, and ours certainly held its share, a lost campaign, a lost position, a lost son, a lost house on a street that no longer wanted her watching it. But the ending we actually chose to hold on to was simpler, and far more ours than hers. It was the sound of a quartet finishing its final song on our wedding day, delayed but never truly stolen. It was 2 officers stepping back into their cars, satisfied, leaving joy exactly where they'd found it. It was a groom walking back to his bride, hand steady, day still theirs, because in the end, that's what she never managed to take from us. No matter how many notices, how many calls, how many clipboards or flashlights or hired investigators she threw at 2 years of a life we were simply, quietly building, the one thing that was always, entirely, ours to keep, our joy. Unstolen, and finally, undeniably, ours. Sometimes, late at night, Simone and I still sit on that same porch, coffee cooling between us, and talk about how close we came to letting fear write the ending instead of patience. The strange, she says, how much of survival just comes down to refusing to disappear quietly. I've since started mentoring young engineers at my firm, and more than once I've caught myself giving advice that has nothing to do with bridges or blueprints at all. Keep your records, trust your instincts, and never assume the people watching you closely have good intentions just because they smile. My mother framed a single printed copy of that first email from Deborah, the one that started the whole paper trail, and hung it in our hallway beside our wedding photos. This is the ugliest, most important thing in this house, she likes to say, only half joking, to every guest who asks. Andre still teases me about it whenever he visits, calling me the groom who broke the internet for a week, though he says it with real pride under the joke. He was the one who first pushed us toward Priya, and he never lets either of us forget it. Not that we would. Carol Simmons and my mother became close in a way none of us expected, meeting for coffee most Sundays, trading stories about the neighborhood the way old friends do, though their friendship, like ours, was born from something neither of them would have chosen if they'd had any real say in it. The Wilsons eventually told us the full history of their 20 years on the street. Long before Deborah, long before any of this, a reminder that patterns like hers rarely start or end with just one person, and that real change usually asks a whole community to finally start paying attention. Every June, we host an anniversary dinner in that same backyard, and every year the guest list grows a little. New neighbors, old allies, sometimes even strangers who found our story online and wanted to say it helped them stand their own ground somewhere else entirely. In some other yard, some other fight. I used to think justice would feel like triumph, loud and satisfying, the way it does in the stories people tell afterward. Mostly it felt like exhaling. Like finally setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I'd been carrying since the day that first laminated notice appeared on our mailbox. Simone says the truest ending isn't the board vote, or the article, or even Deborah driving away for the last time. The smaller than that. Unaware she'll grow up on a street that finally learned, the hard way, what it actually means to welcome someone. And when people ask us now, at dinners or in interviews, what we'd tell someone facing their own Deborah, our answer hasn't changed since the day Priya first asked it. Stay calm. Find your people. Ever let anyone convince you that your joy needs their permission? Roland, a year into his own presidency, told me once that the hardest part of taking over wasn't the paperwork or the disgruntled residents who missed Deborah's old order. It was undoing the quiet culture of fear she'd built, where people assumed silence was safer than speaking up about anything at all. He started something small that first spring, an open forum before every board meeting, 10 unstructured minutes where any resident could raise a concern without a formal complaint form. Attendance was low at first. By the second year, it had become the most crowded 10 minutes of the month. James still brings up that afternoon on the lawn whenever new family joins for a holiday, telling it a little differently each time, though the ending never changes. 2 officers, 1 groom, and a woman who'd spent 6 years mistaking authority for the truth, finally learning the difference between them. My mother kept the Deborah drawer itself, empty now, repurposed for takeout menus and spare keys, though she still calls it by its old name out of habit. Some things you don't rename, she told me once. You just let them mean something different than they used to. Simone went back to the hospital full-time not long after our daughter was born. And she says the same steadiness that got her through those months now shows up in how she talks to frightened parents in the pediatric ward. The quiet certainty that facts, delivered calmly, can hold up a room. As for me, I still walk the fence line some evenings. Not out of vigilance anymore. Just habit. Checking on the tomatoes we finally planted where Deborah's old sightline used to be. It's ordinary now. After everything, boring turned out to be exactly what we'd been fighting for all along.